Greetings and welcome to my channel. This is Sorcerer Tal. You can also find me on Facebook in the Sorcerers Guild. Today on Magical Theory, we are going to be talking about time magic and how to do it, accessing both the higher self and the future self. Okay, so in order to do that, I will need to define the terms future self and higher self, as well as discuss a little bit more on the actual theory behind the idea, and then we will discuss how to do a particular time spell that I have been working on, and then after that, we'll even get into a little bit about the results that I have had so far with the time spell. I want to say I started it 4 years ago, but things have gotten a little strange. Anyways, we will get into that part at the end, so stick around for that. It's kind of interesting. Anyways, first, let's go ahead and define these terms. The first term that we want to talk about is the higher self. Now, I'm going to be giving two different definitions for the higher self. One is the term one we'll be talking about first, and one is more the ideal self, or the I. And that is the part that is in the eternal now. But the eternal now is not the only place where time, well, it doesn't really stand still in the now. We'll get into that in another video. We'll talk about it a little bit in this one, but not quite yet. Anyways, first we will be talking about the higher self and the idea of the mental plane in a very two-dimensional concept of existence, yeah? Okay, so I've talked a lot about how there is the mental plane, which is the realm of information, and as that information moves, it becomes energy, which is the process of information in transfer, and that creates the astral realm. And then as that energy condenses around that information, it becomes material. E equals mc squared. Yeah, energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. That's how much energy or flow of information condenses around each material object. But now we're just getting off on a tangent. So we have the material plane where all that energy condenses down. In this particular video, we're mostly going to be talking in this part about the mental plane. Okay, so we have this triangle, and on the very tip of each point of the triangle, on the very end of the corner, the points, there is a spot where it is purely that realm. And we can learn to perceive from these points. And when we perceive from these points, it becomes purely that. And the realm of the mental plane is pure information. So when we reach out to that very center point of the mental plane, we reach a point where it is all information. Yeah? There is no longer even a sequence of events. Therefore, there is no past, present, or future. And when we perceive from this point, that is a form of the higher self, because we are pure information. There's no bias. There's pure objectivity, even about the self. And that's going to become very important as the conversation continues. Okay, so that is the higher self point that we are talking about. And from there, because from that point, it is still the self. So we can connect to the other parts of the self. And from there, of course, we have the old selves, old iterations of the self, and we have the future iterations of the self. And that's where this idea of the future self comes in. Yeah? The future self is that knows, has already experienced things that we are yet to experience. So that's the part we want to communicate with, so that we can achieve our ideal self by choosing the future self that is the most one we want to be like, and trying to follow to where that iteration of ourself, follow the path that they took to get where they are now. Okay, so now I've defined a future self and the higher self. Now there's another higher self here that is also part of this equation, And it is the other end of the communication, and also what we're ultimately trying to get to when we are speaking of the future ideal self. Okay, so hopefully I haven't gotten too confusing just yet, because I'm about to add another layer. Okay, so the ideal self, or the I, or some might argue that this is the true higher self, is that part of us which is in the eternal now. That is beyond time, in the center, essentially, in the very middle of this pyramid that I was talking about, or the triangle. We're still at a triangle, yeah? So when the triangle in the very center is the ideal self, or perhaps the higher self, and that is, at this moment, where we should be ideally simply being balanced. So the future ideal self would be a concept of the higher self, or it's a concept of the higher self, in that it is the ideal self evolved to a point that it is in the eternal now. And that's where this triangle becomes a pyramid, because then we rise up from the center with each evolution or revolution, and we rise up, and we have these future selves up here that we are trying to reach to. Okay, now hopefully I didn't confuse you too much with all of that, because now we're going to get to the how-to. And the how to do it portion of this is fairly simple, now that we understand these definitions. So, in order for this to work, we need to be able to contact that outer higher self at the very point of the mental plane. And that, of course, requires meditation on the mind itself, and focusing on that information. And we don't have to get to that very point every time. We want to work at it over time, and just imagine ourselves refining down to that point. And we just keep working at this as the working goes on. You don't have to have this perfect at the beginning of the working, because we are reaching to a pinnacle. There's, no matter how far we reach towards that fine point, there's always going to be more, yeah? As much as I say there's a point there at the very end that's nothing but information, this is one of those, in a way, unattainable goals. Not that we can't get to a point where this will work, and to where we have gone beyond the concept of time and a sequence of events. I don't want to say time, where we've gone beyond the sequence of events to where everything is simply information, but that it always can be refined more. And so at first, when you're meditating on this, what you're looking for is to begin feeling that point where the sequence of events inside your mind has ceased. Yeah? And then we can't really ask for a message from our future self, because that hasn't occurred yet. What we do is set the momentum. And by that, what I mean is we're actually going to be sending a message to our previous self. And we can do this simply through the meditation to moments that we remember of ourselves previously. And you can start with sending a message to yourself last week, and then farther and farther down the chain. And then after a while, you're going to want to get some pictures. I have some pictures that I started mine with. I have one from when I was 15 and one from when I was 7. And these are both moments where I remember the picture being taken. And I have them above my altar where I can work with them regularly. And I send messages to my former self. And it's not always direct words. It's more of just a pushing of information. Yeah? Because it's very difficult to get clear communication to come through that way. I can't just think back to myself the lottery numbers from last month and have myself from now and have my last month's self go write them down. It seems to be a little more subtle than that. But we'll get into that more with the results so far. My point here is that at least at first you want to push almost just a greeting to yourself, establish communication, so that you get used to this idea of thinking back to yourself. And then as time goes on, you want to start thinking back to yourself at the point where you started these spells, but also into the pictures, because that's why you think at the pictures, is you want to create repetition and sequence. A repetition of sequences where you were doing the same thing and sending information back and keeping that cycle going. And so the more you send information back, the more momentum you gain on that, and eventually you are that person sending the information back who was to someone who is in a receptive state to pick that up. So it should be more effective from the time that you casted the spell than it would be for anything that you're trying to affect before that. And so at this point, I'm actually going to be adding a third step to what's not in a picture, is taking a picture of myself now, adding that to the picture on the altar, and then above that, putting a mirror so that there is always a reflection of what I am in that exact present moment, and pushing that information past to previous me's, so that future me will push it down to his previous me's, including myself in the present moment. Okay, so as this is going on, the reason we are bringing up the other version of the higher self, or the ideal self, is because that's what we eventually want to connect this to. Because that is the goal, is to evolve into the ideal self that we desire to be. So as we begin this connection, and that's why, as you'll see in the picture that I shared of the spell that I'm working on, that's why the personal sigil is there as well, because that is an indication or a symbol of the full or higher self, ideally. That is the purpose of the sigil, is to give yourself form. So we're pushing all of this into evolving into that ideal form with the personal sigil, if you use a personal sigil. You don't have to use a personal sigil to make this work, but you want to be accessing that ideal self. And as you begin reaching up to the future self and back down, it will become part of that process as you do the meditations. So, how the spell works, we'll go over one more time, is you first begin with the meditation of refining yourself down to that point of information. I literally visualize myself going up into a pyramid, into the mental plane, and then as I enter into that point, I allow everything else to drop and focus on going deeper and deeper into that single point, until it is the only thing that you feel. It is the only information that you are perceiving, and then you're beginning to access that part of the mental plane, and you begin sending a message back to a moment you can remember. Ideally, it'll be a moment that you can remember, that you also have a picture of. So if you can, especially if you have a picture that you can remember being taken, you can remember the picture being taken, and you have the picture, that is a good place to start. and you can start. I started at 15. I started with the 15 and then worked my way back to the 7-year-old. But it'd probably be more effective if you started with a picture you took a week ago. Maybe take a picture now and then start the spell in a week with that picture and then start working your way backwards in smaller steps. And you could even change out the pictures on your altar as you go along to have younger and younger pictures of yourself. That would probably be more effective than how I have done it. But I started with the 15, and then I went back to the 7, and now I just keep, when I do the meditations, I imagine it going back to communicating with those 2 times, and with the me that is from 4 years ago that started the spell in front of those pictures. Okay, so that is how the spell works, is we do the meditation, bring out, and then once we are done with the meditation, we get the picture, place that on our altar, and then we look at the picture while entering that same state and try to access that same state with our eyes open and sending the message back into the picture. Yeah? And that is essentially how the spell works. Like I said, at this point, I'm going to add an extra step and take a picture of myself as I am now. And then also put a mirror up there so that the present moment is always reflected within the mirror. And hopefully that will help mirror the effect into the present moment from my future self. Okay, so that is how the spell is cast. Now we will talk about results. Now, as I said, I started this spell 4 years ago, and well, that is definitely when I put up the pictures. But the thing is, well, we're pushing back. We're working with time here, yeah? So, I have memories now from when I was a kid that are like I was communicating with my younger self. I have a lot of memories that are thoughts that you wouldn't think a child that age would have, and a lot of memories when I was, well, at 8 years old, that are very, that at the time I remember thinking that it was quite the thought for me to be having, and not necessarily, and outside thoughts that were outside of the paradigm I was having at the time. Yeah, like things that 8-year-old me wouldn't even consider. Stuff about, well, questioning Christianity and stuff. I mean, some of the big questions I have about Christianity that made me realize I couldn't be walking both paths at once are thoughts that, well, now looking back, it seems like they were kind of foreign to my mind. So maybe it's hard to say exactly when this started, because I have all these memories, even thoughts about the idea of speaking to future selves that very much predate when I started this spell. Okay, so other than that, since I've done that, I've felt a lot of pulls to do things that later on make sense. Like things that I have added, little things that I have done for part of a spell. At the time I didn't exactly understand why, and then later on it all links together. And maybe the present me didn't know what I was up to, but part of me seems to have had a plan all along. It was just putting the pieces together. So it's almost like there's a higher self of me, a future me, kind of guiding my actions at times, and things have gone are going smoothly in a lot of ways, and my life has changed significantly in the last 4 years. Most of which is for the better. I can't say everything that's happened in the last 4 years is for the better because of COVID, but there is a lot of things that have smoothed out, and I'm beginning to see a clear plan of where I want to go, simply because there's a part of me that's already there and is whispering back to me how to get where I am from my ideal self for this timeline and the things that I want. Yeah? So what we're doing here, that's actually part of the spell that I didn't get into quite so much. So we're going to back up just a little more. We're going to back up just a bit back to the spell part. Okay. So, the future self. You want to envision what future self it is that you want to be. That ideal self. That you want to be in 3 years. And have that, and connect that to the part that is whispering back to you. And the longer you do this, the farther the chain is going to be. Yeah, so I'm right here at 4 years, and I've guided myself from 4 years ago to this point. Which is true no matter what way you look at it. You've guided yourself to this point. But through the spell, I have actually been sending information back to myself from when the spell started to get me to where I am now. Okay, so let's see. We've covered the how-to, we've covered what the future self is, the higher self, and the ideal self. We've talked a little bit about how we're reaching to that part of us that has evolved into our ideal self and allowing it to whisper back to us, send breadcrumbs on the trail so that we can follow it to its future. Like I said, I have not been able to send myself winning lottery numbers. Though honestly, I haven't tried anything quite that significant. I am going to be adding layers to the spell, so there's going to be updates on this in the future. But that will have to be in a future video, since I'm not getting any updates from my future self, as I'm saying that at least. So that's going to be it for this episode. Thank you once again for joining us. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please take the opportunity to do so now. Until next time, bright blessings and an interesting fate. This has been Sorcerer Tal.